is a great adventure story. One I know well, because while it happened, I waited at home, worrying and praying for the gentle, brave man who became the world's greatest explorer. My name is Elizabeth. The man was my husband, James Cook, and this is his story as he told it to me.
I was born on the windswept moors of Yorkshire in 1728. My family was poor, and there seemed little chance to advance myself. I determined to change my situation. After leaving school, I worked with my father as a farm labourer until I was 17. Then I served a short apprenticeship in a ship's chandler shop. There I met and talked to sailors, and I learned to dream. I wanted to see things no other man had ever seen. I wanted to travel further than any other man had ever been. I went to sea.
For 9 years, James worked on collier brigs.
Yes, I grew used to the tossing and the rolling of the ships, the roar of the wind, the almost inedible food, not to mention the cramped, uncomfortable conditions below deck.
But he accepted these hardships, for the sea was by now in his blood. When he was 27, his employers, the Walker brothers, offered him command of a ship, but James refused. I knew his eyes sought horizons far beyond the coast of England. He joined the Royal Navy to serve in the war against France. A British fleet was sent to try to capture the French colonies in Canada. Although he'd been in the Navy only 2 years, James went to Canada as master of the HMS Pembroke.
When I arrived, the capture of Quebec was being planned. To reach this city, ships had to travel up the St. Lawrence River, which was uncharted and full of dangerous shoals and rocks. Enemy encampments guarded it. I was chosen to chart the river.
This he did by night, working with a hooded lantern in a small boat. Because my husband's charts were so accurate, the Royal Navy ship sailed through the shoals of the St. Lawrence and took Quebec.
After the war was won in Canada, more charts were needed. I was given the job of charting the coast of Newfoundland. When the weather was too bad for the ships to work, I kept my cabin and studied mathematics and navigation. When we were on the south coast of Newfoundland, I had the opportunity of observing the eclipse of the sun. I reported this to the Royal Society in London.
His report greatly impressed them. The Society was planning an expedition to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti in 1769. James was chosen to command that expedition. He was further instructed that after the transit had been observed, he was to carry out an exploration of the Pacific in the hope of discovering a great southern continent believed to exist there.
My ship was Endeavour, a cat-built bark 97 feet long and 29 feet in its widest part. She would be slow at sea, but able to carry a great many provisions.
I'm reading from the journal of Captain James Cook, my husband. On August 25th, 1768, he wrote,
At 2 p.m. got under sail and put to sea, having on board 94 persons, including officers, seamen, gentlemen and their servants, near 18 months' provisions, 10 carriage guns, 12 swivels, with good store of ammunition and stores of all kinds.
2 of James' companions on Endeavour were the notable botanists Joseph Banks and Dr. Daniel Solander. The voyage had hardly started when they ran into heavy gales with rain, which caused them to lose a small boat and a large number of poultry. James hoped to replenish the loss when he reached Madeira, where he planned to take on fresh supplies of water, meat, and vegetables. Then at Madeira, tragedy struck. He gave the order to let go the anchor.
Look out there, mate! Look out for the anchor rope!
The warning came too late. An anchor rope caught around the leg of the master's mate, Alexander Weir. He was pulled into the sea and drowned. Endeavour left Madeira, and James was sad at the loss of a good man.
We made our way to Rio, where we were treated very badly. The Portuguese viceroy there accused us of being pirates. Only if we hired a local man as our agent would he permit us to take on supplies. I breathed a sigh of relief as we left Rio and headed for Cape Horn.
Because it was said to be the most dangerous place in the world for sailors, I dreaded the time Endeavour would have to round it. However, as he told me later, they had no trouble and were soon into the Pacific Ocean. They made good progress and reached Tahiti on April the 11th. At our home after the voyage, Mr. Joseph Banks told me he was much impressed by the natives.
They were a really fine-looking race of people and very friendly. As soon as we anchored in the bay, the ship was surrounded by canoes full of natives wanting to sell us fruit and fish. 2 chiefs came aboard, and Captain Cook invited them to dine at his table. We became friends and exchanged gifts.
Unfortunately, as James confided to me later, the natives proved to be very light-fingered. They stole everything they could lay their hands on.
They even stole my quadrant, which was to be used to observe the transit of Venus. However, it was recovered, though damaged. We managed to repair it in time for the observation.
They made a successful observation of the transit of Venus. Then the big moment came for James. He told me many times of his wish to explore the great southern continent, of which so many sailors had spoken. He headed south.
August 25th, 1769 was the anniversary of our leaving our beloved England. I agreed the crew should hold a celebration. While I was walking on deck, Mr. Banks came to me.
My dear Captain, we've travelled so far. Surely there must be some doubt we will ever find this southern continent.
There is no doubt, Mr. Banks. Have no fears on that.
But Mr. Banks' fears were well-founded. As Endeavour went further south, the intense cold killed some of the livestock. At last even James began to doubt the existence of a continent so far south, and turned the ship northwards. And then...
Land ho! Land ho!
As I was to learn later, the land was the North Island of New Zealand. The crew of Endeavour were the first white men to see it since Abel Tasman had landed there 127 years earlier. James decided to put in for fresh water and provisions.
I went ashore with Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander and a strongly armed landing party. The inhabitants proved far from friendly. Their bodies were painted with red ochre. They shook their spears at us. It was a frightening spectacle. They grew still more hostile, and we were forced to defend ourselves. We managed to regain the ship without loss of any of our party.
James was patient, and later got provisions from the Maoris. He discovered that New Zealand was 2 islands. Endeavour sailed around both, and James made charts of the coastline. I read in his journal before me.
As we have now circumnavigated the whole of this country, it is time for me to think of quitting it.
So my husband left New Zealand. His waking thoughts were never far away from the fabled Great Southland. As he told me,
I directed Endeavour westward and hoped to reach Van Diemen's Land, but a southerly gale forced us northwards. Then one morning, shortly after dawn, I heard the cry we'd all been waiting for.
Land ho! Land ho!
From this point, Endeavour followed the coast northwards until he reached a bay which James felt would offer safe anchorage.
I went ashore, taking with me Mr. Banks, Dr. Solander, and one of the crew. As we came closer to the beach, we saw a group of natives gathered. All but 2 of them ran away as we came nearer. These 2 waved spears, and one threw a stone at the boat. Mr. Banks became alarmed.
Take care, Captain.
We'll see what this will do, Mr. Banks.
They're running towards that bundle of spears. Watch out, Captain. Their spears might be tipped with deadly poison.
But they don't travel as far as a musket shot.
Thank goodness, Captain. That's made them take to their heels.
James and Mr. Banks tried to make friends with the natives, but they wouldn't come near the white men. James told me that Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander were extremely pleased with what they found on this new land.
Captain, I have never seen such a collection of strange plants. This is a botanist's paradise.
You'll give me an idea, Mr. Banks. We shall name this place Botany Bay.
They stayed there a week. For 5 weeks, Endeavour travelled north along the uncharted coastline of what was to become known as Australia. James told me that they had to keep watch night and day, testing the depth of the water, for there were dangerous shoals and rocks which seemed to jut up from the seabed like jagged pyramids. Then...
She's aground! She's aground! What do we do?
On the night of June the 11th, there was a sickening crunch as Endeavour struck the edge of a coral reef. Within seconds, everyone was crowded above decks. Mr. Banks was looking for Captain Cook.
Captain! Captain!
Here, Mr. Banks.
We are miles from land. Our situation is hopeless.
Take courage.
Every man to his post!
She's taking in water!
Man the pumps! Lighten the ship! Jettison everything we can spare!
James recalled vividly that terrible occasion. He said the men were magnificent. They worked like demons. Throughout the long night, the men worked and prayed that Endeavour might be freed. The following day, their prayers were answered. A light breeze sprang up, and she was afloat again.
She's free! She's free!
They maneuvered the ship towards the shore for repairs. James, in his journal, tells us that they were in that place for 6 weeks.
While Endeavour was being repaired, I explored the mainland. The animals I saw were among the strangest I have ever seen. One of them was mouse-coloured, the full size of a greyhound, which it also resembled down to its long tail. I would have taken it for a wild dog, but for its walking or running, when it jumped like a hare or a deer.
We know now that James was referring to the Australian kangaroo, which no European had seen before. Ready for sea again, they threaded their way through jagged reefs and headed north. Endeavour reached the northern tip of what was later named Queensland, at the entrance to Torres Strait. James went ashore for his last visit to the Australian coast. A ceremony was held, during which he hoisted the British flag.
I hereby take possession of the entire coastline I have just charted in the name of His Majesty King George III of England. I name this country New South Wales.
Eagerly I awaited his return after the long voyage home. The whole enterprise was a triumphant success. A year later, James left me once more on a voyage during which he became the first explorer to cross the Antarctic Circle. He sailed south until he reached the ice wall, thus destroying the myth of another great continent at the South Pole. This voyage lasted 2 years. Secretly, I prayed he would go journeying no more. But one night he came to me.
Elizabeth, the sea calls me.
And so, in 1776, he embarked on yet a third voyage. I watched his ship clear to the horizon. As well I did, for I was to see him no more. This voyage was to search for the Northwest Passage. James discovered Hawaii, which he called the Sandwich Islands, and then explored the Alaskan coast. He returned to the Sandwich Islands for the winter. There he was killed by the islanders. When they first saw him, they took him to be a god. They were disillusioned to find he was only a man. But such a man. His friends tell me he was regarded as the most skillful navigator in the British Royal Navy and the greatest explorer in the history of the world. But to me he was, most importantly, a brave and gentle man who on a certain cherished night after his return from the far ends of the earth said quietly to me,
Elizabeth, my dream has been fulfilled. I have seen things no other man has ever seen, and I have traveled further than any other man has ever been.